The very last thing that I want to show you that we're going to do in this unit is subtracting mixed numbers with regrouping. And let's talk about what regrouping is. So let's go back to second grade where you learned how to subtract whole numbers and regrouping those whole numbers. So let's look at the equation 36 minus 18. Right? And you know that when you subtract, you want to start with your ones place. So you have 6 ones and you want to take away 8 ones from those 6 ones. Well, you realized in second grade that you couldn't do that. If I have 6 cupcakes, I can't take away 8 cupcakes. Okay? So you had to figure out what you had to do. Well, a part of second grade is that you learn to regroup from the next place value over. So the next place value over I have is the the tens place. And I have 3 tens minus 1 10. Well, I can borrow one of those tens and now it becomes 2 tens. And I take that 10 that I borrowed and I'm going to add it to my ones place. So instead of 6, I now have 16. Okay. Well, I can take 16 ones and I can subtract 8 ones from it. So I'm going to do 16 minus 8, which is 8. And then go to your tens place and subtract it. 2 tens minus 1 10 is 1 10. So 36 minus 18 is 18. Well, let's take that knowledge and let's transfer it over to mixed numbers. When you have mixed numbers that you have to regroup, you're going to do the same thing and you're going to borrow. So let's go ahead and talk about what that looks like. Let me go ahead and erase this. Okay. Let's take an equation like 4 1/2 minus 2 3/4. Okay. And we know from our last video that when we are subtracting mixed numbers, or fractions in that case, with unlike denominators, which means our denominators are different, the first thing that we want to do is we need to make them the same. So just like in the last couple of videos, we need to take our denominators and find the least common multiple between those denominators. Okay, so let's find our multiples of 2 and our multiples of 4. I have 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12. Okay, and then my multiples of 4. 4, 8, 12, 16, and 20. And I want to find my least common multiple between 2 and 4 is in fact 4. Okay, and remember we want to take that denominator and we want to make it equivalent to our least common multiple. Well, I know that 3/4, my denominator, is already 4, so 2 3/4 is going to remain the same. But I do have to take my 1/2 and to convert it to an equivalent fraction where my 4 is my denominator. Well, I know that I can take 2 times 2 and that equals 4, and then whatever I have to do to the denominator, I also have to do to my numerator. So let's rewrite that fraction. Well, instead of 2 1/2, instead of 4 1/2, I now have 4. And 1 times 2 is 2. 2 times 2 is 4. And if you remember equivalent fractions, 1/2 is equivalent to 2/4. Okay, so when I rewrote it, I now have 4 2/4 minus 2 3/4. Now that my denominators match, I can go ahead and subtract. Well, remember from our last video when we're subtracting mixed numbers, I first want to start with my whole numbers. So 4 minus 2 is 2. And then let's go ahead and subtract our fractions. Well, when we are subtracting and adding fractions, our denominator stays the same, and we just add or subtract. In this case, we're subtracting our numerator. Well, 2 minus 3. Well, you'll realize that you can't do 2 minus 3. So let's talk about how we can regroup in order to solve this. When we are subtracting whole numbers, we borrow from our next place value. Well, in this case, we don't really have a place value. Well, we do, but we're talking about a whole number and a fraction placed together to make a mixed number. So instead of borrowing from our tens place or our hundreds place or our thousands place, we're going to just borrow from our whole number. Okay, so if I have 4 and I want to borrow a whole number, I am now going to make that 4 a 3. And I can borrow that whole number and I can add it to my fraction. Well, I'm not just going to borrow 1 and put 2/4 plus 1. I'm going to make that 1 that I borrowed a fraction. Well, you guys know that fractions like 2/2 equals 1, 3/3 also equals 1, 5/5 equals 1. Well, when we're adding and subtracting fractions, our denominators have to be the same. So in this case, that 1 that I borrow is now going to be 4/4 because my denominators now match. So that 1 that I borrowed is now going to become a fraction, which is 4/4. And let's erase some of this stuff on the bottom so that I have some room to work. Okay. So now let's rewrite that fraction and see what that looks like. Well, I borrowed from my whole number, so now my whole number is 3. Okay. Well, now I have 2/4, and I added that 1 that I borrowed, made it a fraction, and I'm going to add it to my 2/4 to make essentially more fractional pieces. So I know that 2 plus 4 is 6, and my denominator stays the same, which is 4. Okay. So I borrowed a 1, made that 1 a fraction, and added it to 2/4 that I already had. And I have 6/4. And it's going to look a little strange because you guys aren't really used to seeing a mixed number where your whole number is normal, but then your fractional part is a improper fraction. And that's completely okay. Because essentially what we did is we borrowed that 1 and added it to the fraction that I already had there. Okay. So when I rewrite it, it now becomes 3 6/4 minus 2 3/4. Well, now let's subtract it and see if we're able to do it. Go ahead and subtract your whole numbers, which is 3 minus 2 is 1. And remember, our denominator stays the same, which is 4, because we're talking about fourths. And then now let's see if we can subtract our numerators. Well, can I do 6 minus 3? Well, yeah, 6 minus 3 is 3. So 4 1/2 minus 2 3/4 is 1 3/4. Okay. Let's look at another example. Let's take 5 1/3 minus 2 7/9. Okay. And again, my denominators are different. So the first step that I want to take, or that I want to do, is to make those like denominators. And we know that from our previous practice that we can take our least common multiple between 3 and 9 and make our denominators equal our least common multiple. But we first got to find our least common multiple. So let's talk about my multiples of 3. 3, 6, 9, 12, 15, 18. And my multiples of 9. 9, 18, 27, 36. Okay. And my least common multiple is 9. Okay. So let's make our denominators equal that 9. Well, I know that if I take 3, I can multiply that by 3. And whatever I do to the denominator, I have to do to the numerator. Okay. So let's rewrite it. 5 3/9 minus 2 7/9. Because again, 2 7/9, my denominator is already 9, so I don't have to do anything with that. Okay. I'm going to erase this down at the bottom so that we can have some room to work. Okay. Well, let's go ahead and start subtracting. 5 minus 2 is 3. And then my denominator stays the same because we're subtracting. And then 3 minus 7. Well, if you notice, we can't even do that. So let's see what we can do to solve it. All right, let's borrow from, or let's regroup from our whole number. So instead of that 5, I'm going to regroup and make that 5 a 4. Okay, and take that 1 that I borrowed and add it to my 3/9. Again, I'm not going to do 3/9 plus 1 because then that's just 1 3/9. So instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to make that 1 a fraction. Well, my denominator is already 9, so why don't I just make that 1 a 9/9 or 9/9 and add them together? Because again, I'm taking that 1 and I'm adding more fractional pieces to my fraction to make it a bigger fraction. Okay, so now let's rewrite it. I now have 4. Because remember, I borrowed, so that becomes a 4. And let's go ahead and add 3/9 plus 9/9. Well, 3 plus 9 is 12, and my denominator stays the same. So again, it's always going to become a mixed number where my fraction is an improper fraction. Okay. So let's rewrite it. 4 12/9 minus 2 7/9. And I know that I can go ahead and subtract this because my denominators remain the same because that's the first step that we did. So let's subtract our whole numbers. 4 minus 2 is 2. 12 minus 7 is 5. ninths stays the same. And I know that 5 ninths cannot be simplified, so my final answer is 2 and 5 ninths. All right, let's look at one last example. The reason why I want to show you this example is because my answer is going to be something that needs to be simplified. So I want to show you how you can follow all of these steps and then simplify your answer. Okay, so let's look at 7 3/12 minus 5 2/4. Well, if you notice, my denominators are different, So I want to find my least common multiple between those two numbers and make them the same. Well, my multiples of 4 are 4, 8, 12, 16, and 20. And my multiples of 12 are 12, 24, 36, and 48. Okay. My least common multiple between the two are 12. So I want to make my denominator equal 12. Well, in 7 3/12, my denominator is already 12, so leave that the same. And then convert 5 2/4. Well, I know I can take 4 and multiply that times 3 to equal 12. And whatever I do to the bottom, I need to do to the top. So then that becomes 5 6/12. Let's erase this down on the bottom, make a little room for you guys. Okay, so I have 7 3/12 minus 5 6/12. Well, if you guys notice, 3/12 is smaller than 6/12. So I need to, or when you go to subtract, I can't do 3 minus 6, so I have to regroup. Okay, I'm going to regroup by borrowing from my whole number, so that 7 becomes a 6. I can take that 1 that I borrowed and make it a fraction. Well, my denominator is 12, so why don't I just go ahead and do plus 12/12 to make that 1, okay? Because here's what happens if I don't use 12/12. Say that I have 3/12, and I want to say, well, why don't we just do 6/6? Well, my denominators are different, so I can't add those together to make more. So go ahead and always make sure that your denominators are the same, okay? Okay, so let's rewrite that fraction. That becomes 6, and make sure you add these together. 3 plus 12 is 15, and my denominator stays the same, which is 12. Minus 5 6/12. I didn't do anything to this right here, so it stays the same. Okay. Well, let's go ahead and subtract. 6 minus 5 is 1. 15 minus 6 is 9, and 12 stays the same. Okay. And I know that sometimes we are going to have to simplify. So let's look at 1 9/12. Well, I know that 9 and 12, sorry, I had it on the finger. 9 and 12 have numbers in common. So I know that that has to be simplified. I can't just leave it as 1 9/12. So we did all that work, and now we still have to simplify. So let's go ahead and simplify that. And remember, if you always have to refer to that anchor chart that I sent home with the difference between least common multiple and greatest common factor, please refer to that. That's why I wrote it out for you guys, so that you guys can utilize it. Okay. All right, so when we're simplifying, that's when we use our greatest common factor. Okay, so let's find our factors between 9 and our factors between 12. Well, my factors of 9, remember the numbers that can be divided into 9 equally, is 1, 3, and 9. My factors of 12 are 1 and 12. Remember, we always start with 1 in itself and then talk about all the numbers in between. So 1 and 12, I can multiply 2 and 6 to get 12, or I can divide 6 and 2 into 12, and I can also divide 3 and 4 into 12. Well, the difference between this is I want to talk about my greatest common factor. Okay, so the ones they have in common are 1 and 3. 3 is the greatest one between those two numbers, so that's what I'm going to use. So I have 1 and 9/12, and I'm going to take that 3 and I'm going to divide it to make it into smaller terms. Well, my whole number stays the same, so that's 1. 9 divided by 3 is 3. 12 divided by 3 is 4. So it simplifies down to 1 3/4. So I know that was kind of a long problem, and there was a lot of steps to it, but I promise the more you practice, the easier it will become. And guys, I know this is sped up super fast. This is not normally how fast we would move in the classroom. But I promise you guys, please keep practicing. And if you have any questions, as always, you can reach out to me. I know it's sped up, but I at least want to get this out to you guys so you can learn a little bit, and hopefully we can return to school sooner rather than later, and we already have a jump start so that we can get back to small groups and get back to working one-on-one together, and slowing things down for a little bit, because I know this has been sped up. So thank you for being so patient. I know I miss you guys like crazy, and I cannot wait to get back to school. So again, please, if you need any help, reach out to me. I know this is just crazy with what's going on in our world right now, but have faith and know that you guys will be back to school soon, and we will hopefully get back to our normal schedule, and we will be reunited, and we can continue, hopefully finish out the school year strong. Like I said, I miss you guys, and I will see you soon.